My brother's wife smirked. "You'll only embarrass us, stay home," and he never spoke up. I walked away without a word, then they woke up to empty vendor calendars and a wedding no one could put back together. I had been helping with that wedding for almost 9 months before I finally got tired enough to stop being polite about it. At first it was supposed to be simple. My younger brother, Nate, got engaged in the spring, and everybody in our family acted like that was the only thing that mattered anymore. My mom cried. My dad acted like he was trying not to cry. My brother looked happy in that quiet way he always had, like he was relieved to have something stable in his life. And his fiancée, Lauren, seemed perfectly normal around the rest of us. A little intense, maybe. A little polished. The kind of person who never looked like she had a hair out of place and always remembered to say please and thank you in front of people. I did not dislike her right away. That would be dishonest. I just thought she was the kind of woman who made every conversation feel like a performance. She was nice enough when other people were around. It was only when the room got smaller that she started acting like everyone else existed to serve her timeline. Nate worked a lot. So did I. I run operations for a regional plumbing supply company, which means my life is spreadsheets, invoices, trucks, and people who swear they sent me things they absolutely did not send me. I am good at organizing chaos. That is not me bragging. That is just the only reason I became the unofficial wedding problem solver in the first place. At one of the early family dinners, Lauren mentioned how stressed she was trying to keep track of everything. She was not wrong. They had picked a venue, a caterer, a photographer, a DJ, and a florist in a weird rush because they wanted a spring wedding and kept changing their minds about the guest list. Nate was terrible at pushing back on anyone. My mom, who has always been the kind of person who hears a problem and immediately starts fixing it, looked at me and asked if I could help set up a master calendar. I said yes, because that is what I always do. I told myself it would just be a few emails. Then it turned into confirming deposits. Then it turned into comparing menu options because Lauren kept changing her mind about whether she wanted plated dinner or buffet. Then it turned into calling vendors when she forgot the calls. Then it turned into checking what had actually been paid and what had not. At some point, I became the person all of them contacted when they had a question, because apparently every wedding only has one adult in charge and nobody tells you when that happens. I made a shared folder. I made a spreadsheet. I made a second spreadsheet because the first one became useless after Lauren decided she wanted to move the ceremony start time by 45 minutes, and nobody could remember which vendor had what arrival window. I put in dates for final head counts, cake tasting deadlines, rental drop-offs, payment due dates, and all the little things people forget until the morning of the event. I used my own phone number for vendor calls because Lauren kept saying she was too busy at work to sit on hold. I paid one of the early deposits with my card when a vendor needed it same day, and Nate said he would reimburse me. He did reimburse me, eventually, after I asked twice. I let that slide because it was family and because I honestly thought I was making things easier for everyone. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was assuming that being helpful would make me less visible. It usually does not. It just makes you available. The problem started small, which is how these things always happen. Lauren would forget to forward an email and then act annoyed when I asked about it. She would make decisions without telling anyone, and then act like I had been included the whole time. She would change a menu or a floral detail, and then get irritated when the numbers no longer matched the spreadsheet I had built based on her earlier choices. Nate would nod along. He always nodded along. He was not stupid. He just hated conflict so much that he would agree to almost anything if it meant the conversation ended. I noticed pretty early that Lauren liked it that way. She liked making the choices and having someone else absorb the mess. I tried not to judge her too hard because wedding planning does weird things to people. Everybody gets a little controlling when money is involved, and family is watching, and every relative thinks their opinion matters. But there was a point where stress stopped being an excuse and started looking like a personality. That point came at my parents' house in late summer. We were doing one of those planning evenings where everybody brings a notebook and pretends it will stay organized this time. My mom made too much food. My dad kept walking in and out of the room because he does not know how to sit still when something emotional is happening. Nate had brought the updated guest count. Lauren had brought printouts from a bridal magazine and a strange amount of confidence. I had brought my laptop and the latest version of the vendor list. I had also brought a folder with printed confirmations because I had learned that if I depended only on texts and email threads, someone would swear later that they never saw anything. That night was supposed to be about finalizing the seating chart and reviewing the timeline. Instead, it turned into one of those awkward family silences where everyone is aware something is off, but nobody wants to say it out loud. Lauren kept moving the ceremony time around because she wanted better lighting for photos. That made the photographer's arrival time tighter. That pushed the florist's setup window. That changed when the rental company could bring the chairs. That changed when the caterer could start. I explained all of that calmly because I had already explained it 3 different times and I was trying to keep my voice even. Lauren gave me that patient smile people use when they are about to be rude while pretending they are not. Then she said in the softest possible way that I would only embarrass them if I showed up to the wedding and that I should just stay home. She did not look angry. That was what hit me hardest. She looked amused, like she was finally saying the part she had been saving. Nate saw it. He absolutely saw it. He just did not say anything. He lowered his eyes, went quiet, and kept staring at the paper in front of him like the floor had suddenly become more interesting than his own brother being insulted in front of our parents. For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard her. I waited for Nate to correct her. He did not. I waited for my mom to jump in. She looked shocked, but she did not want to blow up the room. I waited for myself to get angry. What happened instead was colder than anger. I remember being weirdly calm. I remember staring at my own spreadsheet, at all those little boxes and deadlines I had been filling in for months and feeling like I was looking at somebody else's project. I put my laptop into my bag. I gathered the printed confirmations. I stood up. Nobody said anything. I did not say anything either. I just left. I drove home in silence and kept thinking about Nate's face. Not Lauren's, his, because he had not defended me and that told me more than her smugness did. I did not sleep much that night. I kept going over the last several months and rethinking everything I had shrugged off. How many times Lauren had made a decision without asking. How often Nate had apologized for things that were not his fault. How many times I had told myself I was being sensitive. By the next morning, I had made a decision. I was not dramatic enough to announce. I was done being the person who made their mess workable. I was not going to sabotage anything. I was not going to throw a tantrum. I was not going to call the venue and pretend to be a concerned relative. I was just going to stop carrying things that were not mine, so I sent one email. It was polite. It was short. It said that I was no longer the point of contact for the wedding and that all future communication should go directly through Nate and Lauren. I copied both of them on every vendor thread I had been managing. I attached the spreadsheet. I attached every confirmation email I had saved. I attached a simple note with every deadline highlighted in yellow. I did not explain my reasons. I did not complain. I did not mention anything about being embarrassed. I did not mention that Lauren had spoken to me like I was a disposable cousin instead of her future brother-in-law. I just removed myself from the middle of it. That should have been the end of it. It was not, because once I stepped away, the thing they had been leaning on me for became visible. And once it was visible, everybody could see how little of it had actually been handled by them. The first sign came 3 days later when the caterer called my cell and asked why the final head count had not been submitted. I told him I was no longer coordinating the wedding. He sounded annoyed but not surprised. He said he had already been having trouble getting a response from Lauren. That should have been my warning that they had not been keeping up with anything. I checked the spreadsheet out of habit. There were 4 payments that had been due or were about to be due. 2 had not been made. 1 had been partially paid, which I only knew because I had the receipt saved in my folder. 1 had been rescheduled by Lauren without telling anyone and was now sitting in a weird gray zone where the vendor was waiting for confirmation that never came. I almost called Nate. I did not. I wanted to see what they would do on their own. Maybe that sounds petty, maybe it was. But at that point, I was no longer invested in protecting them from consequences they had been refusing to acknowledge. A week passed, then another. The florist sent a reminder about the deadline for final flower counts. The rental company wanted the last chair and linen numbers. The DJ needed the final timeline. The photographer wanted the family shot list. Each time I saw one of those messages, I forwarded it to Nate and Lauren without comment. Every time they replied late, or not at all, or with some version of they would get to it after work. I started noticing a pattern. Lauren had become strangely defensive whenever anyone asked for actual numbers. She kept saying everything was under control, but nobody who is actually under control talks like that. Nate started avoiding the group chat. I would see him read things and then disappear. My mom began asking me separately whether I thought the wedding was still on track. I told her the truth. I said I had no idea. That seemed to upset her more than an actual answer would have. Then one Friday afternoon, I got a call from the venue manager. The tone in his voice was the kind people use when they are trying to stay professional while dealing with something they do not understand. He said Lauren had changed the guest count twice. He said the final payment had not come through. He said he had emailed the couple directly and had not gotten a response. I told him to keep emailing them. He asked if I was still helping. I said no. There was a long pause after that. Then he said very carefully that I should probably be glad I was not the one in charge anymore. That was the first moment I realized the whole thing might actually fall apart. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired. I was not hoping for disaster. I just no longer cared enough to cushion them from reality. The next thing that happened was a smaller embarrassment, but it was the one that finally made me start paying close attention. Lauren had apparently told the bakery to switch the cake design and forgot to tell the florist, the venue, and the photographer about the new reception layout. That meant the floor plan no longer matched the setup the rental company had confirmed. It also meant the cake table had been moved to a place where the catering staff said it would block service. I only found out because the bakery sent the updated invoice to the wrong address, and I saw it in my email because I had been copied on the original order. At that point, I was irritated enough to go back through everything and look at the whole timeline from the start. That was when I found the first real crack. One of the deposit confirmations had been altered, not forged in a movie villain way. Just changed enough to make a payment date look later than it was. I noticed because the numbers did not match the bank record I had saved from when I paid it. I stared at it for a long time. Then I checked the folder for the rest of the receipts. There were 3 other places where the paperwork had been adjusted after the fact. Not by me. I knew my own files. Someone had been opening the shared documents and changing things. I would like to say I immediately thought it was Lauren. I did not. I thought maybe it was a glitch. Maybe someone had accidentally made edits. Maybe one of the vendors had updated the file. That was generous of me. It was also stupid. The truth became clearer the following week when Nate asked to meet me at a coffee shop across town. He looked awful, not physically, just emotionally. He had that exhausted face people get when they have been avoiding a problem for so long that the problem has started sleeping in their house. He said the wedding budget was tighter than he expected. He said Lauren had been telling him not to worry. He said she kept insisting the vendors were handled. He said he had started checking the bank account connected to the wedding fund and had realized there were charges he did not recognize. I remember feeling the bottom drop out of my stomach. Until that moment, I had assumed the problem was disorganization and entitlement. Then I started realizing there might be money missing. He had brought printed statements. I am not kidding. Actual bank printouts. I had to stop myself from feeling weirdly proud of him for finally bringing something on paper. The account was joint in name, but most of the deposits had come from him, his fiancée, their families, and a small contribution from our parents. There were several withdrawals I could not account for. One was labeled as address alteration. One was for a hotel charge. One was a transfer that ended up in an account I did not recognize at first. Nate said Lauren had told him those were all wedding-related. The problem was that the amounts did not line up with anything on the vendor invoices. That is when the conversation changed for me. It stopped being about hurt feelings. It became about whether he was being lied to. I went home and sat at my kitchen table for almost 2 hours with every receipt, invoice, and bank statement I had saved. I matched dates. I matched amounts. I matched vendor names. Then I found the thing that made my chest go cold. A payment that was supposed to go to the rental company had not gone to the rental company. It had gone to Lauren's personal account. I checked 3 times because I did not want to believe it. The reference note had been changed to look like an internal transfer. She had moved wedding money into herself. I do not know whether she thought no one would notice or whether she planned to move it back later. I do know she had used my organization to hide it. For a while, I just sat there feeling stupid for not catching it sooner. Then I remembered all the little times she had brushed off questions and changed subjects and acted like the details were beneath discussion. I had assumed she was overwhelmed. She had been steering everyone away from the numbers. That was not stress. That was management. I called Nate back the next morning and told him I needed to show him something. He came over alone. I laid everything out on the table, the receipts, the spreadsheet, the bank statements, the payment confirmations. I showed him where the numbers lined up and where they did not. I showed him the transfer into Lauren's account. I showed him the vendor invoices that still showed unpaid balances. I showed him the email threads where I had forwarded deadline reminders and they had gone unanswered. He went quiet in that same way he always did when something was too heavy for him to handle. This time, though, the silence did not feel like avoidance. It felt like shock. He asked me if I was sure. I told him I was sure enough to be angry, which was not my usual emotional state. He looked like he wanted to deny it. He did not. That was the part that told me everything. If he had thought I was wrong, he would have argued. Instead, he just sat there staring at the papers like they were speaking a language he had never learned. He admitted then that Lauren had been handling the account changes herself. He admitted he had stopped checking because she kept telling him she had it covered. He admitted he had been embarrassed to keep asking about money because every time he tried, she made him feel like he was being controlling. That was the other half of the story I needed. She had not just hidden the money. She had trained him not to question it. At that point, I told him we were going to go through everything, line by line, before anyone else said another word about the wedding. He did not like that. He was too worn out to like anything, but he agreed. That afternoon, we sat there for almost 4 hours. I pulled everything into one folder. I made a clean timeline. I separated confirmed payments from disputed ones. I marked every deadline that had passed. I documented every vendor that had not been paid. I created a list of which items were under contract and which were only under verbal hold. I was not trying to be dramatic. I was trying to make sure the truth could not be twisted later. That turned out to matter more than I knew, because Lauren found out he had started asking questions. I do not know how. Maybe she checked his phone. Maybe somebody told her. Maybe she just sensed the mood had changed. What I do know is that by the next evening she was at our parents' house acting offended that anyone had dared to make a fuss over paperwork. I was not there for the first part of that conversation. My mom called me halfway through it and said I should come over. She sounded shaky. When I got there, Lauren was already in full performance mode. Not yelling. She was much too careful for that. Just offended, wounded, and very certain she was the only person in the room being unfairly treated. She claimed the money transfers were temporary. She claimed she had been moving funds to cover wedding expenses that the bank had not processed correctly. She claimed the vendors were being difficult. She claimed I had overstepped by involving myself at all. Nate was standing there looking like he had not slept in days. My dad had his arms folded. My mom kept glancing between all of us like she was trying to hold the whole room together with her face. What Lauren did not expect was that I had not come alone. I had brought printed copies of every transaction and every vendor correspondence. I had also brought a statement from the rental company saying their invoice remained unpaid. I handed Nate the packet and let him read it himself. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he asked Lauren, in the quietest voice I had ever heard from him, why the wedding fund had been redirected into her personal account. That was the moment she stopped pretending. Not fully. She still tried to explain it away. But the explanation started unraveling almost immediately because she could not keep the details straight. First, she said it was for alterations. Then she said it was for vendor deposits. Then she said the money had been borrowed and would be replaced. Then she said I had misunderstood the transfers because I never liked her. That last one was almost funny in how weak it was. I had not said a word about not liking her. I had not even been rude. The facts were doing the talking. Nate asked her directly if she had used wedding money to pay off her own credit card. She denied it. Not convincingly, just reflexively. Then he showed her the transaction history from the joint account and the purchase trail that matched the charges he had seen on the statements. That was when she finally looked scared. I'm not proud of how satisfying that was. It was just the first time she seemed to realize the room was not on her side anymore. She started crying at that point, not the clean, pretty kind. The angry, desperate kind. She said she had been under pressure. She said the wedding had become too much. She said everyone was judging her. She said I had made everything worse by stepping away. That accusation was ridiculous, but it was also revealing. She had gotten so used to me fixing things that she genuinely believed my refusal to keep doing it was the damage. Nate did not yell. He did not make a scene. He just asked for the card statements and the remaining contract copies, which was the calmest thing I had ever seen in a family conflict. Lauren said she had them. She did not, at least not all of them. That became obvious when she started digging through her purse and drawers and car and coming up short on several things that should have been basic. Receipts, timeline notes, a printed copy of one vendor contract, a venue addendum, a deposit slip. At some point, my mom went into the kitchen and started crying quietly into a dish towel. My dad walked outside because he needed air. I stayed because somebody had to keep the paperwork together and because I was too angry to leave. By the end of that evening, Nate had made a decision without saying the word decision. He told Lauren he was not moving forward with the wedding until every account was reconciled. He told her he needed to see proof of where every dollar had gone. He told her he was taking the bank statements and the folders home. He did not ask. He just took them. That was the first time in months I saw him do something that was not about keeping the peace. Lauren left in tears. My mother looked horrified. My father looked like he had seen this kind of train wreck coming and hated that he had been right. I drove home with the remaining documents and spent most of that night making copies. The next morning, the real fallout started. Lauren called Nate repeatedly. Then she called my mom. Then she called me. I did not answer. I was not being cruel. I just did not trust myself to stay calm if I heard another explanation that treated obvious theft like an administrative mistake. She left messages full of wounded language and half apologies. She said everyone had misunderstood. She said I was poisoning Nate against her. She said the wedding would be ruined if we did not stop making everything into a crisis. That would have been almost impressive if it had not been so transparent. Meanwhile, the vendors were still waiting. And now, because nobody had been responding to them for weeks, they had begun releasing dates. That part happened faster than I expected. The florist had already booked another event for part of the same weekend because the final confirmation had not arrived. The DJ had put the time slot back on the calendar after not hearing from anyone. The rental company had started scheduling other deliveries. The caterer had been giving their event coordinator the side eye for days because the numbers kept changing and no final headcount had come through. The photographer had moved on to another wedding inquiry for the same afternoon once the remaining balance was still unpaid. In normal life, these things are manageable if you catch them early. We had not caught them early, not because I was careless, because they had been lying and drifting and assuming someone else would hold the whole thing together. I remember the exact moment the scale really tipped. It was 2 days after the argument at my parents' house. Nate had gone to the bank to sort out the wedding account. He called me from the parking lot. He told me they had flagged the transfers as suspicious because several of the payments had gone from the joint account to a personal account, and then out again to outside charges that did not match wedding vendors. That was the bank's wording, not ours. They wanted both account holders present for a formal review. I went with him the next morning. Lauren did not show up. She said she had work. That alone told me more than anything else. You do not say the wedding is being sabotaged and then skip the banking appointment if you are actually trying to fix things. The banker was polite in that professional, overworked way people get when they are dealing with a family disaster in a side room. He had the transaction printouts. He had the transfer logs. He had the notes from their fraud department review. He walked Nate through the movement of funds. Some of it had been used for legitimate wedding expenses. Some of it had not. A portion had been transferred to Lauren's account. A portion of that had then been used for personal debt payments, one hotel charge, and a few purchases that had nothing to do with the wedding at all. There was no giant criminal mastermind reveal. Just ugly, boring, provable misuse of money. That is the thing people forget. Most real betrayals are not theatrical. They are tedious. They are little paper cuts of dishonesty that add up until you cannot pretend the wound is accidental anymore. Nate sat there reading the statements with his jaw clenched so tight I thought it might hurt. He looked embarrassed. He looked angry. He looked relieved in the worst possible way, like he had finally been handed evidence for something he had sensed but did not want to believe. The banker asked whether he wanted to freeze the account. He did. That was the first decisive thing he had done since the engagement. The freeze happened immediately. The bank also advised him to keep the records in case the couple chose to dispute any of the transfers. I spent the rest of that day pulling a full binder together. I printed everything. I labeled tabs. I made sure dates and amounts were readable. I added a plain summary page at the front because nobody in my family enjoys reading dense documents unless they are required to. I did not do it to embarrass Lauren. I did it because once a lie gets this big, it can survive on confusion if you let it. I was done letting confusion protect her. By the time the binder was finished, the wedding had become a logistical disaster. But it was still technically salvageable, which is what Lauren clearly thought when she and Nate tried one final meeting with the venue. I did not go into the meeting expecting fireworks. I went because Nate asked me to. He needed someone calm in the room. The venue manager had already been looped in about the unpaid balance and the shifting timeline. The reception hall looked exactly the same as it had when we first toured it, which made the whole thing feel even sadder. All that polished wood and fancy lighting and linen samples. And now we were walking in to try to decide whether any of it could be saved. The manager had the contracts laid out. One by one, the problems became impossible to hide. The ceremony time change had not been finalized with the photographer. The florist's setup window had been missed. The DJ's hold had lapsed. The rental company had already reassigned part of the equipment. The caterer had received no final head count and would not commit without one. The cake order had been altered too many times, and the bakery needed a firm confirmation before they could guarantee production. There was no one issue to fix. That was the real problem. There were too many. Lauren tried to argue that everyone was being unreasonable. Nate did not back her up. I think that is when she realized he was no longer defending her by default. That changed the whole shape of the room. The manager said, very professionally, that several dates were no longer available because the vendors had already moved on. That was the first time I saw Lauren genuinely panic. She had assumed that because the weekend belonged to them on the calendar, it would keep belonging to them. It did not work that way. Once a vendor releases a slot, it is gone. Once a photographer books another wedding, the original date is dead. Once a florist commits the flowers and staff elsewhere, there is no magic backup aisle option waiting in a closet. By the time we left that meeting, the wedding was effectively over even though nobody had used the word canceled yet. I sat in my car afterward and just stared at the steering wheel. I did not feel victorious. I felt the way you feel when you watch someone walk straight into a wall you warned them about, and they still manage to act surprised by the impact. Nate called me that night and told me he had ended the engagement. He was careful with the words. He said he could not move forward with somebody who had been hiding money and lying about the accounts. He said he did not trust the story anymore. He said he was sorry he had not listened sooner. I told him the truth, which was that I was sorry too because I had let myself believe this was just wedding stress for too long. That was the part that hurt more than I expected. Not the money, not the lost vendors, the fact that I had spent months giving someone the benefit of the doubt while she was actively pulling the floor out from under my brother. The breakup did not happen cleanly. There were calls. There were messages. There were family members getting involved who had no business getting involved. Lauren's mother called my mom and accused us of ruining everything by overreacting to a temporary financial issue. My dad, who is usually the most easygoing man alive, finally said the wedding was already ruined by the person who emptied the account. I do not think he had ever spoken so directly in his life. Nate moved out of the apartment he had shared with Lauren because the lease was in both names and he did not want to stay in a place full of reminders and arguments. That turned into another practical mess. Furniture had to be divided. Utility bills had to be split. A shared storage unit had to be sorted. One of his credit cards had to be changed because she had memorized the number for a vendor charge and then used it on something unrelated. He spent 2 weekends dealing with all of it. I helped where I could. This time, though, I did not do it in secret and I did not let anyone tell me I was overstepping. He asked. I answered. That was the difference. My mom cried a lot more than she admitted to anyone. She had spent months picturing a wedding and then a family future, and then all of that got torn apart by something as ugly as dishonesty with a bank account. She was also embarrassed, which she should not have been, but people always manage to find a way to blame themselves when somebody else behaves badly. My dad mostly got quiet and practical. He talked about the lease. He talked about the bank. He talked about making sure Nate had all of his documents. He talked about not losing track of which bills belonged to whom. It was the least dramatic kind of support, but it was exactly what Nate needed. As for me, I had a lot of strange little aftermath moments. Vendors started reaching out directly because they wanted to confirm the wedding was actually off before relisting the date. The florist thanked me for finally giving her a clear answer. The photographer said she had already assumed something was wrong because too many timelines had been changing. The caterer, who had probably seen every kind of family disaster imaginable, sounded almost relieved to know he did not have to keep waiting. I kept thinking about that phrase from the night Lauren told me to stay home. You will only embarrass us. It had been meant to cut me out. Instead, it ended up describing the person who had been doing all the embarrassing things with our money. I never got an apology that felt real. Lauren eventually sent one of those emails that tries to sound mature while still blaming everyone else. It said she was sorry the family had misunderstood her intentions. It said she had been under stress. It said she hoped someday we could all move forward without bitterness. That was rich considering she had drained the account and lied until the bank printed the proof for us. Nate did not reply. I advised him not to. Some messages are not meant to be answered. They are meant to be filed away with the rest of the evidence. A few months later, the practical consequences were still unfolding. He had to eat the cost of some deposits that were non-refundable. So did Lauren, where the transfers could be documented. The venue kept part of the fee because the cancellation happened too late to recover everything. The bakery refunded one portion and kept another. The rental company charged a partial release fee. The photographer was the easiest because her contract had the most generous rescheduling language, but she still kept what had already been paid. All of it added up to a brutal amount, not life-destroying, just painful. The kind of money that forces you to sit with your own bad judgment for a while. Nate took it hard at first. He was embarrassed. He kept saying he should have known. He said he felt like an idiot. I told him being manipulated does not make someone stupid. It just means they trusted the wrong person. That helped a little, I think. It helped me too because I needed to hear it for myself. I had trusted the wrong person in a different way. I had trusted that helping would be respected. I had trusted that being useful would keep me in the family loop instead of making me a target. I had trusted that if I kept calm and handled things properly, other people would behave like adults. That one was on me. I should have seen the signs sooner, the little dismissive smiles, the way Lauren never actually thanked me unless other people were watching, the way Nate stopped speaking up around her, the way every fix turned into more work for me while she took credit for everything that looked clean. I ignored it because I did not want family drama. That turned out to be the one thing that made the drama worse. A year later, things looked different. Nate is still my brother. That sounds obvious, but after a breakup like that, nothing in the family is completely obvious anymore. He moved into a smaller place. He is more careful with money now. He asks questions when people try to rush him. That probably sounds like a small change, but it is not. It is huge for him. He has a better sense now of what it means to trust slowly instead of automatically. My parents are more protective of him than before. They are also more suspicious of any future partner who acts like accountability is a personal insult. I have become much less eager to volunteer for people who think grateful and useful mean the same thing. They do not. I still help when it matters. I just keep my own copy of everything now. If there is a contract, I save it. If there is a deposit, I get a receipt. If there is a deadline, I write it down somewhere that nobody else controls. That may sound paranoid. It is really just experience. Sometimes I think about how close that wedding came to happening anyway. If I had swallowed my pride and kept carrying the load after Lauren told me to stay home, I probably would have kept making the whole thing look stable right up until the day it collapsed. Maybe that would have made them feel better. It definitely would have made me feel worse. Walking away without a word was the first honest thing I had done in months. It gave the truth room to show itself. That is the part people do not always understand about conflict. You do not always need to slam the door. Sometimes the strongest move is simply refusing to keep pretending that the floor is solid when you can already see the crack. I did not ruin that wedding. Lauren and Nate did that themselves with their own choices, their own lies, and their own refusal to treat reality like it mattered. I just stopped covering for them long enough for everyone else to see it. And once the bank statements came out and the contracts missed their deadlines and the vendors moved on to other clients, there was no putting it back together. Not really. Not in the way they wanted, not with a last-minute apology and a reshuffled seating chart and a promise to do better. Some things, once exposed, stay exposed. That was the only reason I ended up in the stronger position. I stayed calm. I kept records. I let the paper trail do what the paper trail was always going to do. And when the dust settled, the people who had laughed at me for caring about the details were the ones stuck explaining why the details had disappeared. It was ugly. It was expensive. It broke my brother's engagement and embarrassed both families. I would never call it a good outcome, but it was honest. And after months of watching someone smirk her way through our trust, honest was the only thing that felt like winning.